Ladies and gentlemen, let's Red Gaming Telecom video. Let us further discuss the Xbox One's GPU. So there's a couple of things in this video that we're going to be discussing that have been on the minds for a long time. The first would be, are ROPs holding back the Xbox One in terms of resolution? And the second main thing would be regarding the time slice reservation for the GPU. You may have remember that there was a certain portion of the GPU's performance allocated towards system. So we're going to be going through the interview and we're going to give comments as I go, and then I'm going to of course explain everything in another video, and I'm also going to do a lot more analysis in a second one, maybe this one, it depends how long it takes us to go through it all. So anyway, Andrew Goosen began. He is one of Microsoft's technical fellows, and he started out by saying Xbox One has a conservative 10% time slice reservation on the GPU for system processing. This is used for both GPU processing for Connect. Out of quote for a moment, he basically means compute stuff. So that would be equivalent for game type of things, for example, like physics and artificial intelligence and so on, going back into it. And for rendering of concurrent system content such as snap mode. The current reservation provides strong isolation between the title and system and simplifies games development. Strong isolation means the system workloads, which are variable, won't perturb. Out of quote, I absolutely love his use of perturb, he should get many points for that. The performance of the game rendering. In the future, we plan to open up more options to developers to access the GPU reservation time while maintaining full system functionality. So before we go too much into this, let's actually get everyone onto the same page if you're not exactly sure what he means. All he's basically saying is that if you were to look at the Xbox One, or any console for that matter, it has certain functions that are running in the background. These include, of course, Kinect sensing. Obviously, it has to figure out what you're doing. For example, if you put your hand up, it needs to actually compute that, oh, okay, you know, I see that you've put your hand up, and then work out kind of the gesture that you're doing. It also needs to do things such as, for example, those snap-ins, you know, how you've seen their pretty UI and how all the gestures work and how you could simply quickly access programs. All of that takes, well, performance. That's, as I've said for a long time, not free. Now, they're basically stating that 10% of the GPU currently is being reserved exclusively for these functionalities. In other words, you're looking at about 1.2 T-flops of computing power, rather than 1.32. So in other words, all you're doing is taking the total performance of the machine, which is about 1.32 T-flops of computing power, and then you simply take away 10%. Okay, pretty simple so far. Hopefully you're all on the same page. So let's continue. In addition to the asynchronous compute queues, in other words the GPU stuff out of quote, the Xbox One hardware supports 2 concurrent render pipelines. The 2 render pipelines can allow the hardware to render the title content at a high priority while concurrently rendering system content at low priority. The GPU hardware scheduler is designed to maximize the throughput and automatically fill holes in high priority processing. This can allow the system to rendering to make use of the ROPs for fill, for example, while the tile is simultaneously doing synchronous compute operations on the compute units. So what in the heck does he mean by all that stuff? Well, basically, all he's saying is that there are queues on the system and things are being placed there, and basically they mark things as either high or low priority. High priority stuff takes precedence, in other words, it will get rendered first, and that would obviously be things such as the game's title, because quite obviously speaking, you don't want the frame rate to start tanking. And then you've got other things which are less high priority, for example, system UI, that type of thing, and that will be rendered when it can be. So in other words, it'll all be put onto a queue. Now, theoretically, this will mean that Quite simply put, with that and the system reserve taken into account, you shouldn't really have issues of the Kinect, the UI, and much more running simultaneously and affecting gameplay. So let us move on for a moment to something a little bit different. Let's talk about ROPs. Now, ROPs are also known as render output units, although they're also properly known as raster operations pipeline. Now, it's basically, and it is, the final step in the rendering process. So, after all of the scene has been created, after the pixels have been calculated, after the lighting's been added and everything else, so in other words, it's pretty much the opposite end as the draw call, which of course the GPU will receive from the CPU. The ROP is what's in charge of basically writing all that information and assembling it. Now, the Xbox One has exactly half of the amount of ROPs of the PlayStation 4. The PS4 has 32 ROPs. Whereas on the other hand, the Xbox One obviously has half the number. And so it can be very tempting for people to immediately discount, the Xbox One says, oh, it's got half the performance, but that's not necessarily true. So let's discuss this just for a moment. Yes, some of the ROPs, some of the parts of the frame may have been ROP bound. However, it is more detailed analysis we found that portions of a typical game's content frames are bound, that are bound on the ROP and not bound on bandwidth are generally quite small. The primary reason that the 6.6% clock speed increase was a win over additional CUs, was because it lifted all the internal parts of the pipeline, such as vertex rate, triangle rate, draw issue rate, and etc. The goal of a balanced system is by definition not to be consistently bottlenecked on any one area. In addition, with a balanced system, there should rarely be a single bottleneck over the course of a given frame. Parts of the frame can be fill rate bound, others can be ALU bound, others can be fetch bound, others can be memory bound, others can be wave occupancy bound. God, you can tell I'm tired. I'm sorry, guys. Others can be draw setup bound, others can be state change bound. To complicate matters further, the GPU bottlenecks can change within the course of a single draw call. Okay, so he said a lot of stuff there, and I know some of you are probably not exactly sure what he means by this, and so I'm going to give a brief explanation, and then we're going to move on. As I said, I'm trying to explain it as we go, and then I'm going to give an analysis in, another part / this part, depending how long this takes me. What he's basically saying is that some of it is true to be ROP bound, right? So in other words, sometimes it is the ROPs that are falling behind, and quite simply put, the system's waiting for the frame to actually be created, right? So in other words, to be drawn, to be assembled. Let's just use that word. Let's simplify the verbiage. So let's just say assembled. But what they are basically saying is that most of the time, and I'll read the portion out again, he said, we've found that portions of a typical game content that are bound on the ROPs and not bound on the bandwidth are generally quite small. In other words, what he's saying is that it's not very often that this is. What he is saying, however, is that things such as the vertex rate, triangle rate, and draw calls are often what slow things down. Now, draw issue rate and so on has a lot to do with multiple parts, including the CPU. You may remember in another interview he did point out that they got a substantial increase in performance by simply increasing CPU. And that does allow, of course, more data to be processed by the GPU, because in other words it can send instructions faster. In other words, the CPU can issue more draw calls, which was another point that he made slightly further down. Now, another point he made was that there can be multiple different bottlenecks over a single frame. In other words, one frame can change to another, and the basic premise here is fairly simple. Depending on what's being rendered, depending on the rest of the system load at the time, you can have a situation where one frame is struggling on the ROPs. Another one could be memory bandwidth bound. So in other words, data physically can't be flung around fast enough, therefore the CPU is simply, or the GPU, whichever one, is simply waiting. Another one could be the CPUs being all taken up, so the GPU's just like, when you're ready, I'm just, going to be chilling here, I can't do anything while I'm waiting for you. Now remember, in terms of system times, this is very fast, we're talking a couple of 100 nanoseconds, whatever. We're not talking, super long, but when you start taking into account that over a long period of time, that can start stalling frames. You might get, 1-2 frames per second drop or whatever. He also pointed out, of course, things such as ALU, which is basically the raw floating point or the raw performance of the GPU, which is obviously another point. So anyway, he continued by saying the relationship between fill rate and memory bandwidth is a good example of where balance is necessary. A high fill rate won't help if the memory system can't sustain the bandwidth required to run the fill rate. For example, consider a typical game scenario when the render target is 32 bpp, that means bits per pixel, and blending is disabled, and depth stencil buff surface is 32 bits per pixel, with Z, in other words depth, enabled. That amount is 12 bytes of bandwidth per byte drawn, per pixel drawn, I'm sorry. So that's 8 bytes to write it and 4 bytes to read it. At our peak fill rate of 13.65 gpixels, that adds up to 164 gigabytes per second of real bandwidth that is needed, which is pretty much saturates our ESRAM bandwidth. In this case, even if we had double the amount of ROPs, the effective fill rates would not have changed because we would not have bottlenecked, because we would have bottlenecked the bandwidth. In other words, we balanced our ROPs to our bandwidth for our target scenarios. Keep in mind that bandwidth is also needed for vertex and texture data as well, which in our case typically comes from DDR3. Okay, so before we continue on with this, let's talk a little bit about this. So, technically speaking, when 32 ROPs are used, most of the time, they are for high-end GPUs on the PC. Now, 32 ROPs are generally for something like, say, 2560 by either 1400 or 1600, so 2560 by 1600 or 2560 by 1400. Or, for example, in cases of multi-screen displays, for example, you're outputting to, let's go with tri-monitor setups, so that would be like 5760 by 1080 or whatever, or very high, ridiculous levels of anti-aliasing, and so on. You've also got to look at the GPUs which are typically sporting these. We're looking at, for example, the 7970 or the GTX 780 or the GTX 680 or whatever, and we're talking basically very high performance. So why have Sony gone with 32, I hear you cry? Well, there are obviously going to be 1080p issues where you do need the extra. In other words, there are going to be some times that basically the 16 ROPs are just not going to be enough. In theory, they're going to be holding it back. Now, just how often that's going to be, it's unknown because, well, it's still very early on in the system's life right now. Another point, of course, that we have to talk about here is it could also mean that, for example, anti-aliasing. So in other words, more ROPs do mean that you can anti-alias a lot better. They directly affect the pixel fill rate. But it is fair to say that if they're not fed, if they don't have the bandwidth, if they don't have enough memory bandwidth, or the GPU just doesn't have enough bandwidth, whatever, it means absolutely nothing. So let's continue with the interview because it's not over yet. We've chosen to let title developers make the trade-off of resolution versus pixel per pixel quality in whatever way is most appropriate for their game content. A lower resolution generally means it can have more quality per pixel. With a higher quality scaler and anti-aliasing and render resolutions such as 720p or 900p, some games look better with more GPU processing going on to each pixel than the number of pixels. Others look better at 1080p, with less GPU processing per pixel. We built the Xbox One with a higher quality scaler than the Xbox 360. Out of quote just for a moment, all this basically means is that it will quite simply upscale the image. So let's assume you have a 720p image, it will simply upscale it, blow it up, in other words, to render at whatever output that you choose for the Xbox One. So let's assume you're outputting at 1080p, it will simply blow the 720p image up to 1080p, but it will do a better job than your TV scaler, with less latency, for example. We built the Xbox One with a higher quality scaler than the Xbox 360 and added an additional display plane to provide more freedom to developers in this area. This matter of choice was a lesson we learned from the 360, where at launch we had a technical certification requirement mandate that all titles had to be 720p or better with at least 2 times anti-aliasing, and we ended up eliminating the TCR when we found it was ultimately better to allow developers to make the resolution decisions themselves. Games developers are naturally incented to make the highest quality visuals possible, so we'll choose to make most appropriate trade-offs between quality of pixels versus the number of pixels in their games. We know that certain launch titles, this is out of quote of course, are running sub 720p on the Xbox 360. So for example, we know that Perfect Dark Zero, which was quite literally the first game that I bought, well, one of the first games that I bought for the Xbox 360, I had a couple of launch games of course. Perfect Dark Zero runs 1152 by 640. Meanwhile, you had something like the original Cameo, that would be Cameo Elements of Power, and that did run at true 720p, so that would be 1280 by 720, but with no anti-aliasing. And so obviously, even back in the Xbox 360 days, there were definitely periods of time when certain games just couldn't run it. So the thing of it is, this is my own personal opinions right now. Okay, I understand about the prospect of reserving GPU time, because let's face it, the PlayStation 4 does it, for example, with the memory, the Xbox One has to do it with the memory and so on, but it doesn't particularly help Microsoft's case in this regard, because here's the thing, let's even assume, and they've not confirmed this, but even if, say, Sony were to do the same thing, 10%, it's still that obviously the Xbox One has a significant deficit against the PlayStation 4. In other words, okay, they can claw back resources, just how much is still a little bit up in the air, but ultimately speaking, 16 ROPs is probably going to be enough for 1080p in most situations at 30 frames per second. At 60 frames per second, I think that's when things start getting dicey, particularly when you've got anti-aliasing added on top of that. But then, of course, you've got memory bandwidth issues anyway. So I guess we'll just have to see. Do I really think that this has changed much from Microsoft's perspective? Not really. I mean, we've known that the system's had overheads for a while. And that makes sense. I mean, I've said from the beginning that we need, you don't get anything for nothing, right? And that's fair, and I understand. From the perspective of reserving something, so that obviously games developers know what they're working with, that's very standard in the industry. You can't just say to developers, well, we'll just work around you, because, the games developers are going to take as much resources as possible. Obviously, if they manage to open things up, this is going to be improvements to their own API and so forth. Now, obviously, in the case of the Xbox One, they have a fairly unique memory system anyway. Things, for example, like textures, especially after they've been created, are simply read from DDR3, because they're not often needing to be read in most cases anyway. So they're using the DDR3 to hold this type of stuff anyway. So it's still very early. Now, some people are immediately going to start citing, well, is it an indication for the launch party titles? And honestly speaking, I don't necessarily know if this stuff tells us how powerful the system's going to be yet. I'm going to be doing some more analysis on this kind of in my own time. I'm going to be doing some research and reading, trying to get some cases together for you guys. But I just want to put out my initial thoughts on this. And here's the thing. The Xbox One, compared to the PlayStation 4, has had very much moving hardware goals, which is fine. I'm not criticizing Microsoft for that. I'd much rather they say, okay, try to increase the GPU clock rather than not, because that doesn't make any sense. And obviously a system will evolve as you're going forward. Right now, the APIs that they're working with aren't exactly ideal. We know this. The developers have said so. Microsoft have pretty much said they're still working on them anyway, which is fair enough. But from the perspective of games developers, if your hardware is always changing, you can never make the most of it, because one of the benefits, of course, of, well, a closed architecture is that, well, you know what you're working with. But obviously, since they're not really that certain of it, then obviously it makes things a little bit trickier. Anyway, I'm going to leave you guys to think about this video. I'm going to be doing a little bit of research on it myself over the next couple of days, so I can come up with some more thoughts and conclusions for you. But with all that said, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I'm going to get going. So take care of yourselves and bye for now.